We have an amazing resource here. Nate is truly one of our great authorities on the election system, on campaign financing, all kinds of matters of our democracy. And I suspect that many of us in this room have a lot of questions about our democracy broadly this year. So one thing you should know is that he is right now under deadline as the special master of the redistricting process for North Carolina. He's drawing fair districts for them, something he's done for 4 or 5 different states over the years. And so we may be risking democracy in another part of the country by him sneaking out to talk to us tonight, and we're really appreciative of that. So, you know, we really do think about some questions both on this topic and some of those related ones around redistricting and so forth, so that we can really have a great Q&A session after this, because we're going to give a lot of time to it. I think we'll all enjoy that. With that, I think nothing more to do, but please give a big round of applause for tonight's guest, speaker, Nate Persily, please.
Thank you. Thanks. Apropos of my new role as special master, that is the before photo, this is the after, okay? It is the most exhausting thing that I do. First of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Michael, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone here for putting this on. I'm a law professor, a political scientist, and a lawyer. I often say that you can tell when I'm a law professor because I have opinions without data. You can tell when I'm a political scientist because I have data without opinions. And you can tell when I'm a lawyer, well, it depends what my client wants me to say. So I'm gonna shift between those sort of 3 personalities in talking about this question of, can democracy survive the internet? I also sometimes say that as a scholar of the law of democracy, there's a sense in which my job is a little bit like an anthropologist studying human cannibalism, which is that you have to replace normal human impulses of disgust and revulsion and replace them with fascination and curiosity. And so that to some extent, whether you're doing redistricting or dealing with the voting technology or campaign finance reform, consider it a coping mechanism. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those other areas in maybe the Q&A, but I want to specifically talk today about my current research and sort of what I've been trying to do at Stanford, dealing with the effect of the internet on democracy. So let me tell you how I got into this, because I'm not naturally a techie, even though I am at Stanford and it's sort of in the bloodstream there. One of my areas of expertise, as Michael said, is campaign finance. And so when the Citizens United case came down a few years ago, most people looked at that case and said, this is a case about corporations being given individual rights, right? You know, corporations are people and like. If you remember, that case was about how corporations, did they have the First Amendment right to spend unlimited amounts of money on advertising, right? And the Supreme Court said that they did. Advertising with respect to campaigns. The case itself, though, really wasn't about corporate advertising. It was about a movie that was put up on demand by this nonprofit corporation called Citizens United, sort of like HBO on demand or any of the other, Xfinity on demand, or I don't know, Dish on demand. I don't want to be prejudiced here. So the question in that case was whether this movie that you could download, right, off of this on-demand platform was protected by the First Amendment, or could the government essentially ban a corporation, in this case a nonprofit corporation, from spending corporate funds on a movie because it was a hatchet job against Hillary Clinton, okay? And like I said, most people looked at that as a First Amendment case, and is this all about corporations having personal free speech rights? I looked at that case and I said, what this is really about is the future of sort of changing telecommunication in politics. What happens when we move from linear programming, television ads, sort of like the 30-second ads that have been the kind of coin of the realm when it comes to political advertising? What happens when we move from that world into a world of on-demand programming where so much of the political communication is happening principally through the internet, okay? And all of our sort of campaign finance architecture and jurisprudence is predicated on a world where it's television, which is the main mode of political communication. In fact, in the case itself, in Citizens United, there was actually an interesting colloquy between Justice Kennedy and the Solicitor General, where he asked him at one point, he says, so if you can ban a movie, if you can this on-demand movie that Citizens United is trying to put up online, if you can say that a corporation can't put that up, can you ban a book, right? Because, hey, if you can ban one thing, you can ban the other, right? If a corporation doesn't have these speaker rights, they shouldn't be able to put up a book either. And he says, well, this is, and the response is, no, this isn't the case about this. This is, it's about television advertising. He says, well, wait a second. Are you saying that the First Amendment theory of the government allows the government to ban a corporate-sponsored book? And he tries to evade the question again. And then he comes in and Justice Kennedy says, hey, what about that new Kindle thing? Literally says, that new Kindle thing. And he says, that's kind of like a satellite communication, isn't it? Because you beam a book down onto your laptop or whatever, a Kindle device, right? Could the government ban that kind of satellite communication? And again, the lawyer kind of vacillates and tries to get around it. And then Chief Justice Roberts sort of like puts his hand on the table and says, what's the answer? Is it consistent with the government's theory that you would be able to ban a book if the corporation uses its treasury funds in order to fund it? And then the Solicitor General says, yes. And then there was an audible intake of air in the classroom, in the courtroom. And so when I teach my students the First Amendment class, I often say, if you learn nothing else during this semester, don't be on the side of book banning when you're arguing before the Supreme Court, And that case is what led to the court striking, and that scenario led to the court striking down the McCain-Feingold law that was at issue in Citizens United. As I said, for me, it really posed the question of what happens when we change from television as the primary mode of communication to on-demand programming and the internet. And so since that time, we've moved from what I'll show you as sort of the more rosy picture of the effect of the internet on democracy to a more apocalyptic view of it. And there are three big questions, I think, that are posed by the changing communication technology for democracy. The first is, to what extent does the marketplace of ideas, which has been a kind of cornerstone of our theory of the First Amendment and free speech, to what extent has the theory of the marketplace of ideas as the best test for truth really failed in the internet age? It's not clear that the marketplace of ideas was ever either so free or the best test for truth, but certainly in the internet age, I think we're finding that it's not that more voices is lastly leading to greater test for truth. The second is, does democracy require some basic agreement on facts among the population and some minimal trust in institutions, right? Which is not to say that the internet is responsible for all of that, right? But it exacerbates both mistrust and this lack of agreement on facts. And the final point is, does a democracy require some way of defining the political conversation and community which limits it to people in the country who are human, okay, as opposed to foreign intervention into an election, foreign speakers, as well as bots. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about bots with no offense to Otto here. So, as I said, there was a rosy picture of the effect of the internet on democracy up until certainly the 2016 election. There was the sort of repeated sort of fawning of praise, particularly on the Obama campaign's digital campaign geniuses who were able to crack the code of the internet to both raise money and to campaign. There was this rise in small donor fundraising, so that the internet enabled people like Howard Dean and even like Bernie Sanders to raise all kinds of small donor money as well. There was this evolution in micro-targeting that, again, was sort of an element of sort of the tailor-made messaging and mobilization campaigns of Obama and others. And the idea that with the end of television ads, we might move to a more sort of small d democracy kind of environment in which different types of candidates could run that didn't have to have big war chests because they could enable, YouTube or Twitter or the like could facilitate different types of candidacies that didn't have that kind of money. Now, what's happened since the 2016 election is almost, uniform apocalyptic forecasts about what the internet is doing to democracy. And what are those sort of realms? Well, it's the idea, of course, that the internet is promoting fake news, or it's this rise in Twitter bots and the like that allow, as I was saying before, communication from machines impersonating individuals. Or, of course, our friend Vladimir, who is representative of the foreign hacking of the U.S. election. And then as well, dark posts on the internet, the idea that you don't even know when you're being advertised to, and so the identity of people and institutions and foreign governments is being cloaked in the anonymity of the internet, right? So we've moved from the liberation theology of the internet to this apocalyptic forecast, right? So when I analyze this question, I think I'm a little bit different than, I want to say that I usually get 3 criticisms, I should say, whenever I give this talk. The first is, what you think is new is actually old. The second is, what you think is bad is actually good. And the third is, what you think is original, I've written on already. And so let me say that there's a lot of people who are writing about this. Usually, it's of course with the Stanford professors where you hear that. But there's a lot sort of people analyzing this question. And yes, some of the phenomena that I'm going to talk about do have sort of legacy roots. And so something like fake news, right? We've had news, right? We've had propagandistic outlets, monopolistic media companies that have got us into wars and the like. That's not new. And I do want to say that, look, there are good things about the internet for democracy. All of those points that I made that we talked about pre-2016 are still true. There are things that and voices that are enabled by the internet that were silenced in the legacy institutions that preceded it. And then, like I said, there's a lot being written on this, so I don't want to pretend that all of these ideas are original. But again, the focus I want to look at is, what is it about this transformation of the information ecosystem and telecommunication environment that uniquely threatens democracy, okay? And the first feature of the internet that has a uniquely damaging effect on democracy is the velocity of information transfer. So the speed with which, Mark Twain is reported as saying, that you can, that the truth, or the lie moves halfway around the world before the truth puts its boots on. Turns out, if you look on the internet, it's quoted as him saying that in 1917. He happened to be dead by then. But that's just an example of fake news about fake news. But there's something to that, right? Which is that lies travel quite quickly online, and that it's extremely difficult to counter them. Now, that's a phenomenon we all are familiar with, but it has particular relevance when you're talking about elections, because elections have a fixed date and a sort of predictable calendar to them, so that if, hypothetically, there is a dump of emails a week or two before an election, right, or lies that become pervasive in that short period of time, they are unable to be corrected in a way that was maybe true in legacy institutions, right? That is exacerbated by this sort of coin of the realm of political communication in the internet age, which is viral communication, right? The lack of intermediation by admittedly elite and sometimes paternalistic and authoritarian institutions like, say, the 3 networks, right? But in that world, some of the extremes of the information environment that we see today were kept out of the public realm, right? Again, it's not to say that they weren't manufacturing consent or doing whatever else in that pre-internet age. But what we've replaced it with is a premium on virality. And what that means is that whatever types of content are most likely to be forwarded from one person to another are the types that are going to often be popular online and dominate the political conversation. And what are those types of communications, that kind of information? The things that evoke emotion, right? Particularly outrage, anger, sometimes love, a little bit less often, right? But from your Facebook feeds or Twitter feeds, the kind of information that you are most likely to click on or that's most likely to be forwarded to you. Right? Third is the internet gives a megaphone to anonymous speakers, which has previously never been given to them. Yes, we have a long history, a proud history in this country of anonymous speaking. The Federalist Papers, after all, right, were published by Publius. And in case you've seen the musical, you know who one of those authors was, right? So it's Hamilton. You don't know? Okay. All right. There are two others. Their musicals are on the way. But I'm waiting for John Jay, the musical. We'll see. But there's a proud tradition of anonymity when it comes to political advocacy, right? It's even protected under the First Amendment. But the anonymous speakers have never had the kind of megaphone that the internet gives them. That produces two phenomena. One is it enables the kind of extremist and hate speech that we have seen online and that is sort of facilitated by the internet. And that's just a broader category of unaccountable speech, right? It's about speech where you do not have to face the consequences of your actions, right? And your speech. The second is anonymity is what produces the bot problem. So just to be clear what we're talking about, we can talk about more in the question and answer. A bot on Twitter is some of you probably even create them, but a bot, these are the hazards of talking about this in Silicon Valley or San Francisco, is that a bot is an algorithm or just some code that either by itself speaks, right, sends messages into the cyberspace or repeats or amplifies other types of communication. We know that 10 to 15% of Twitter accounts in the US are bots, roughly 40% in Russia are bots. We know the president has retweeted bots over 100 times. So they have real effects. We can't measure it, right? We can measure the amount of sort of bot activity online, but it is a new feature of this information ecosystem that replaces what is primarily human-sponsored conversation with machine amplification of it. Fourth, the internet facilitates your selecting into information ecosystems that are essentially predetermined for your political beliefs. Now, there's a great debate over this question of what we call homophily, right? Is it the case that our online lives are more echo chambers and filter bubbles than our offline lives, right? Because frankly, it's maybe more likely that you will confront a Republican, I say this in the San Francisco, right, on your Facebook feed than you will 5 miles west of here, right? And so one of the things about homophily or echo chambers is that we're becoming politically segregated in so many aspects of our life that it's not clear that the internet, that at least our Facebook feeds and social media feeds are actually that much more politically segregated, but they probably exacerbate the political segregation and polarization that we're seeing in the larger culture. Fifth, this question that I've already alluded to, which is the sovereignty of sort of the ability to regulate the political communication environment of a democracy, right? So a country historically has been, look, the US has a proud tradition of intervening in all kinds of countries' elections. It's not like this is the first time this has happened. However, the web is worldwide after all, and because of the anonymity on the internet, it facilitates the ability of cross-national or non-state actors or state actors to have an influence on other countries' democracies. Finally, there's this question of monopoly. And while it's true that we had 3 broadcast networks that basically had a monopoly, they were treated in some ways as public carriers and the like, the role of Google and Facebook is qualitatively different than those monopolies of yesteryear. Because of the amount of advertising that goes through them, because of the ability of those firms to have such a determinative effect on the political communication, I think that they're in a different position. So much so that their terms of service, their community guidelines are in many ways the sort of new First Amendment of our age because, or I should say that they're determining the bounds of the First Amendment. When I teach First Amendment law, I put up the YouTube or the Twitter community guidelines, and all of them are unconstitutional if they were enacted by the state. Now, that's not actually such a bad thing. In some ways, it might be because our First Amendment law is at such an extreme, internationally speaking. But these, whether it's rules against obscenity or against, they ban, advertisement of guns and drugs, pharmaceuticals, actually probably illegal drugs too, as well as incitement, hate speech, and the like. There's all kinds of rules that these private companies have naturally that would be unconstitutional if the government passed them. The question is really, where do we go from here? Where should the platforms go? Where should the government go? And there are three basic sources of reform. The first is the government, right? And we can see that the US government, with the exception maybe of the limited area of campaign finance disclosure, doesn't seem to be acting to regulate political communication online. Leave net neutrality out of it for just a second. European governments, though, are rushing to fill the void that the US is leaving. And so Germany passed its fake news bill to make, basically fine the internet companies, the large internet companies, 50 million euros for every illegal speech act that occurs on their platform, right? We'll see how that plays out. Secondly, there's platform self-regulation, which is where I spend a lot of my time sort of thinking about this. And that's, are the platforms going to add to those other categories of speech regulation that I mentioned before with new rules with respect to fake news or hate speech? And they have rules on hate speech already and the like. And they have been moving since the 2016 election quite nimbly, I think, even if not as far as I would like them to do, to try to address some of these democratic pathologies. And the final area is self-help, right? Some of you are developers in the room, right? And we have a project at Stanford where we're trying to develop more of this technology. What tools can users have in order to combat things like fake news, like hate speech, like like echo chambers and the like, right? Or to combat bots so that you know that an account is a bot as opposed to a human. Now, when it comes to these three different actors, the state, the platforms, and self-help, there are really sort of 7 categories of reform where we're going to see some action. They all happen to begin with D. That's almost inadvertent. I don't want to be sort of in a kind of Tony Robbins box by suggesting that this is like my 7 Ds to solve your life problems or something. But here are the sort of general areas of reform, and then I'll have some concluding thoughts and we can open it up. The first is, as I was mentioning before, deletion, right? So the internet companies, the portals, have all kinds of rules, terms of service, community guidelines, and the like, about some content that's simply not allowed. Part of the question now is, well, are there other additional types of content, falsehoods and the like, maybe more aggressive monitoring of hate speech that should be deleted from online? The second, where Facebook in particular has been particularly aggressive, is on the area of disclosure, right? Trying to give you more information about the speakers and about the content. So that, for example, they have these fake news flags for news that has been disputed by fact checkers, right? I don't know, have you all seen those fake news flags? I put it up at the beginning. You don't see them all that often. And one of the ironic things is that if you do, you're actually more likely to engage with the story. It's like, oh my gosh, here's something false, it's been flagged. Probably not the effect that they wanted. The other is that there's an interesting Yale study that finds that if they start flagging some of these stories, that there is sort of a abnormally high level of confidence that you have in other things that are not flagged, right? So that then it has sort of those two counterproductive qualities. But disclosure is and in the campaign finance realm, they're aggressively moving to try to thwart government action here to provide for greater disclosure of spending. The third is, and the most likely area when you think about search engines and think about news feeds, is demotion of content, right? Making decisions about the quality of the information and then putting it lower if it's bad quality and higher if it's good quality. Of course, that's fraught with all kinds of normative value judgments, but it's inevitable, right? Because no matter when you put something above something else, you're making a value judgment about what users and viewers should see. Are you going to place a premium on virality, right? Are you going to put a premium on some of the other values that I said at the beginning, or the other pathologies on the internet? 4, Krishna Bharat, who's the founder of Google News, has a really interesting idea about delaying, sort of putting in tripwires on the internet, so that if a story achieves a certain level of virality, we try to, at that point, put a stop on it on certain social media platforms until a human being can look at it to see whether it's true, right? Not eliminate it from the internet, but to just put in some kind of tripwire for virality. Now, those of you who work in internet companies know that's not a small undertaking, right? To basically monitor all of viral communication online, and so you'd need to have some threshold at which you'd have to intervene. But that's another reform idea which is out there. The fifth is dilution. Is there a way of having more good content out there to diminish the significance of bad content? That sounds like a kind of crazy and an almost impossible idea. It's particularly difficult in the United States, where we don't have the kind of public broadcasting and public information arms that the European governments have. So that as much as I bet in this room there's a pretty high viewership and listening audience to NPR and PBS, in other countries, that would be a much larger audience, whether it's for the BBC or particularly in the Scandinavian countries, that spend a considerable amount of money on public broadcasting and the like. And so if you are able, through government efforts, to dilute bad content, that's another possibility. Sixth, distraction and diversion. Now, this again is a sort of more authoritarian response. Jennifer Pan, one of my colleagues in the communication department at Stanford, has done some really sort of path-breaking work on looking at how the Chinese government regulates the internet. On the one hand, there's this walled garden idea that they're censors, right? There's all kinds of information and communication that's censored online. One of the other things that they do is they have literally a 1 million-person army that's monitoring what's being said online, and that sort of guides conversations away from controversial topics. So if Tiananmen Square is the topic of discussion, you sort of have people that come in and they pollute hashtags on particular types of issues. They guide conversations in another direction. You might think, hypothetically, if a certain leader wanted to distract from a bad news story, one way to do that is to start maybe using Twitter in a way that would distract to another controversy, hypothetically. The last is deterrence. And so next Tuesday, I've been invited to a conference I never thought I'd be invited to as an election law guy, which is I'm speaking at the NATO PSYOPs conference. So I was like, all right, that's one I want to take, right? And I thought I was going to like Luxembourg and Brussels. It's in Tampa, okay? So it's like, it looked glamorous, but all right. So I'm a law professor who's going to speak in NATO, great, in Tampa. And so, but part of the question there is how do you deter foreign cyber activity, particularly when it comes to polluting the information environment prior to an election, right? And it's a tricky problem, of course, with our First Amendment. But there are ways that one can do it. I mean, through classic deterrence techniques. You may have seen that we are, forcing, for example, RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik to register as foreign agents, in a sense. Google and Facebook essentially punished websites that were putting up fake news and in order to get money through their ad platforms and like. So there are all kinds of deterrent tactics that one can take. It's still there are still lingering questions, though, I think, about our capacity to deal with some of these problems, especially if we're going to keep the kind of First Amendment tradition that is really unique to the United States. As I said, or implied, in some ways, it's the democratic features of the internet that are threatening the democracy. It is the fact that viral communication, unmediated communication, is leading to these problems, right? That is the bedrock problem that we're confronting in trying to deal with the democratic pathologies of the internet. Secondly, it's hard to think, unless we point to the new information intermediaries as being Google and Facebook and these companies, it's hard to think who else fills historic voids of the kinds of elite institutions that have kind of put bounds on the permissible conversation that precedes an election, right? And it's never really been the case that for-profit companies of this magnitude have had that particular role. We can debate about that, but that, there are certain intermediary institutions, whether you're talking about labor unions or political parties and the like, that simply don't have the power anymore to guide political conversation in ways that they did previously. And then finally, there are really three models out there as to what the sort of future of regulating speech online is going to be, particularly in the political realm. I talked about the Chinese model, right? And that is obviously not a tradition that we want to emulate in the US. You see what's happening in Europe, right? Which is they're trying to sort of split the baby here and trying in getting some kind of liability for these companies, trying to regulate speech online. And then we have the United States, which is really out on a limb when it comes to the First Amendment. Every area of our First Amendment law, whether it's hate speech or libel or pornography and the like, is really extreme by international standards when it comes to freedom of expression. Are we going to be sacrificing that, right? Is it going to be done by government? Is it going to be done by the private companies? And so if the question that I started with is, right, can democracy survive the internet? The clickbaity answer is, the answer may surprise you. I think the jury is out. Our democracy is going to have to adapt to the internet in ways that right now we don't even know. Yeah.
Thank you, Nate. That's fantastic. So Rio's going to be walking around with the mic. Please get her attention. I've got a couple questions to start you off with, but thank you. And again, seriously, thank you for making the time in the midst of this busy time for you. So my big takeaway is that there's a direct line from Hamilton to these bots. That's fascinating, right? The anonymous.
Don't tell Lin-Manuel Miranda. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a franchise or there's a series in that. So one of the things that before we open up to some other subjects, when you look at the other international solutions, and you touched on it a bit there, is there a great solution? But we're just the disposition of Americans means we're never going to do it, or do you have odds on any of these novel approaches to us that could have some chance of getting implemented here?
One of the reasons I spend a lot of time trying to talk to the people at the platforms about this is because I think that they're going to be they're going to make the decisions. I don't think that the governments are quick enough and nimble enough and sort of accurate enough in their laws to really put in the framework that is necessary here. And let me give you an example in this, even in the area of campaign finance, where I think it's actually the lowest hanging fruit, that we should be able to force campaign finance disclosure online, for example. There's currently a law, the proposal, the Warner-Klobuchar law, which would try to deal with this problem of foreign election spending in the U.S. as well as sort of anonymous spending by taking the TV rules and then putting them online. One part of that law says, and we need to figure out, we need to get a library up there of all the ads, so that if a particular campaign is sending some message to you, but a different message to you, we know that and it's disclosed. And we got to have the targeting information. Who are they going after demographically? Seems like a very sensible position. I'm in favor of it. Then when you start talking to the folks at the platforms, they say, you know what? Right now, targeting is like, sure, there's sometimes when you want to say, white suburban women between the ages of 30 and 40. But right now, you're going to be able to do individual level targeting where campaigns are basically giving email addresses to people so that then you're going to end up with individual level targeting for, you're not going to publicize the individual names of people who are targeted. And same with the actual ads themselves, so that, and this is true of the Trump campaign, they ran 100,000 different variations on ads, right? Some of which they don't even know they ran, right? And so you're going to develop, you have to figure out a kind of way of having a library of these ads, which is different than, say, in the legacy institutions. So I think that they're going to be making these determinations, and the technology is moving so fast that we need them. Now they need to be pushed along. In some ways, Europe is going to be the tail that wags the dog here, and we'll see if they sort of respond to these sort of overreaches by European governments in ways that will then be salutary even for our democracy. I should say, and Europe, of course, is not only long. You look at South Korea, they took down, their Federal Election Commission took down 100,000 Facebook posts, not even ads, posts, because of the rule on banning election communication proximate to an election. In France, in the lead up to the election, where there was this big dump of emails on Macron 48 hours before the election, which prevented political conversation about it. The law in France said that You cannot have basically campaigning into 48 hours before an election. Facebook then had to figure a way to block out the email dump on Macron in France, but then allowed everyone else around the world to see it, right? And it's like, and so there's just series of things like this that are happening around the world.
Well, and that's an interesting point. We had a talk actually in our first year here, Peter Schwartz on our board, thinking about the future of the internet, and one of the things that he saw was more local versions of the internet, in the way China does a very oppressive sort of one, but that actually, and that type of thing, I mean, it makes you wonder whether a platform emerging from a different culture, from a different governmental situation, would balance out or at least change some of these dynamics.
Well, that's China, right? I mean, that's basically what's happened in China. That they have replicated a lot of these internet portals with a domestic authoritarian flavor to them, right? And so, but it takes that kind of walled garden approach to really get at this. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? Because as you said, there's diversity around the world, and you talk to the election people at Facebook, and I was like, you guys you have to deal with this stuff every month. Like every month, we have 2 elections per week. They said they're dealing with worldwide, right? And they're dealing. I mean, talk about fake news in the U.S. It's like when they're dealing with the Kenyan election, right? People are dying as a result of these rumors that are going online. And as much as I think they're sort of accessories in all this, they understand the issue, right? If they didn't, 6 months ago, they certainly feel like their backs up against the wall right now. And so, but there aren't easy solutions here. It's a real difficult technical and sort of philosophical fix.
And just one more before we open up to the questions. Let's give a little bit of background on the gerrymandering side of this real quick. Can you start by just explaining to us what a special master is? We were talking about it a little bit earlier. Explain what your role is and just sort of set the frame for folks. And is this exactly what you've done before or a little different? Or?
So I'm under a gag order. So we're all part of this right now. Okay? I can't tell you, obviously, what's happening in North Carolina. I've been a special master a few times. I've been a court-appointed expert to help courts with solving redistricting controversies. I got a nice special master placard. It hasn't helped me at home at all, but my kids still don't listen to me. So what I'm empowered to do right now, as I have in Connecticut and Maryland and Georgia and New York twice for Congress, is that I'm appointed by the court as a nonpartisan expert to resolve the redistricting controversy by promoting and drawing my own plan, and then having basically everybody in the state hate me for it. And then the court then adopts it or makes changes to it, and then...
And everyone will hate you at least a little bit, right? Even the people that you think may be better.
What's always amazing, I can tell you lots of stories, is how sometimes the people you don't expect to hate you end up hating you, but that's why I'm here in California and doing a North Carolina redistricting controversy.
All right, we've got our first question.
My main question, I guess, has to do with the First Amendment and foreign powers. And you mentioned how much protections the First Amendment gives communication here in the United States. But could you have something like FISA that basically just gives no free speech to foreign agents?
This is a really tricky question, something I and Mike McFaul, who's former ambassador to Russia, who's head of FSI at Stanford, we're really trying to think through this. So there is a really open question as to how much sort of the First Amendment transcends our borders. To some extent, you can certainly, I'll give you an example, in the campaign finance realm, you're allowed to ban foreigners from spending any money in connection with a federal election. So you obviously can't do that in the United States. So the First Amendment means something different when it applies not just to foreign governments, not just to foreign corporations, but to foreign individuals, right? So there is a different First Amendment when it comes to foreigners. And so we will try, and if you see what they're trying to do with Russia Today and Sputnik, there are unique regulations that can go after some of these foreign agents of governments. But the internet is an anarchic place, right? And so it's becoming increasingly difficult to figure out really who is behind particular types of speech. And especially when you're sort of dealing with the corporate environment, where you don't really know the identity of the speaker. Is it a domestic? Is it a foreign speaker? What do we do with trolls? What do we do with bots bots could be, where is a bot located, right? You could have someone in the United States that is basically having one of these bot farms that's retweeting foreign content and the like. So this whole sort of jurisdictional element becomes really complicated in the internet age.
We've got another one over here.
Hey, so it feels like a really big problem is just that Facebook has a news feed at all. Like, it's not just posts that people are sharing, but it's also that they have this sort of section of their page that says news feed, and they're not a news organization. They don't have journalists, and it really is just sort of an example of how Facebook is trying to become the internet and the source of all information. And for a lot of people, that is the only source of information for their news. So, I'm interested in, like, how do we go forward, especially when you're talking to these companies that have a vested interest in being sort of the entire internet, and there's just a few companies, and then we have actual journalists that are losing their jobs across the country, and we don't have actual journalism taking place.
So this is a great question, and let me tell you what I think the problem is with Facebook, okay? And one that they recognize, which is that, and it goes back to this small d democratization of information. The thing, you put your sort of nail on the head there, or hit the nail on the head, which is that the news feed really isn't about news, right? And so what Facebook does is it organizes all communication in the same way, so that whether it is a video of your son's graduation, or a Kim Kardashian promotion, or a article from Breitbart, or an op-ed for the New York Times, or just a communication from your friends, it's basically organized in all of the same ways, right? So we don't have any of the cues, the information cues that we have in the offline world, replicated in the online world. So that if you go up to a supermarket checkout counter, right, and you see a publication as you approach the register that says, for example, Hillary Clinton, part of satanic cult in Washington in a pizza joint, right? You are probably going to discount that. You probably discount it no matter what, but you certainly are going to discount it as you go toward the cash register, because you know what the National Enquirer, the Weekly World News, and the like are, right? But when it's organized in front of you in your Facebook newsfeed, alongside every other kind of information that you have, right, it doesn't have some of the same triggers and signals that you would have in the offline world. And so that's so what they need to do is try to figure out ways to develop those information cues. Now, one way that they've tried to do this, and it directly answers your question, is that they're doing an experiment right now that they've done in Sri Lanka and 4 other countries, where they've tried to take the news out of the news feed. I don't know if you've heard about this, right? So they said, all right, let's take the actual journalism, take it from the news feed and put it in a separate news feed. The journalists in that country, the media organizations, lost 40% of their traffic, right? And it's like, best of all intentions, I think, right? But because the media environment in these countries has adapted to Facebook and Google being the main pipes to which they're going to end up getting the news, right? And so, again, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. And the question is, how can we maybe sort of drive them in the right direction?
So jumping off of that, I have an abstract question that needs 2 quick examples, so I'm going to keep this super brief. One is, if you look back in media theory, Orson Welles with War of the Worlds helped do this weird form of education for the world that a news anchor wasn't what you thought it was, by causing mass panic, effectively, but on a benign topic. Right? And the second example is that in trying to do accredited investor laws to prevent people of low income from being swindled out of lots of money because of fraudulent investments, effectively the government prevented the middle class from getting in on some of the most profitable investments of the 20th and 21st century. So there seems to me, and here's the abstract question, there's always this choice between whether you try to structurally prevent some of the worst abuses that new changes in the landscape allow via legislation, or whether you try to educate the entire population as to here's how the people are going to screw you now in a way that they didn't before. How do you think about this trade-off so you don't either over-regulate or try to over-teach?
Yeah. So let me start with the education point. So Sam Weinberg, who is a professor at Stanford, has directed this whole study on whether undergraduates, high school students can tell the difference between fake and real news, right? And he finds that, no, they can't tell the difference. Truth is, neither can most adults. And so he's trying to develop a curriculum to try to sort of educate, but this is no small potatoes here, right? You're basically talking about teaching critical thinking. This is not a new problem, right? And so we, and as you sort of implied, there's always this challenge as to sort of who guards the guardians here, who's going to be the educator, who's going to decide what qualifies as good information, bad information. And this is when the platforms are repeatedly in this bind. In some ways, I mean, the cloud that hung over Facebook prior to the election was the editing of the trending news topic where they had human editors who were then accused of bias against conservative news outlets, right? And so, there was, so then they replaced it with they took the humans out of the process, and now we have them being faulted for what's happening with their algorithms. So I think you're right. That is in some ways the big question, and it's not a unique question to the internet age, but we are dealing with, I think, unique problems now that require a different kind of solution.
Hi. First, I want to say hi to Renee, who I just now met on Twitter through friends. Hi, Renee.
Can we pair anyone else up here?
Renee will be speaking for us in April. Thank you.
Thanks.
Glad you know when you're speaking.
I had to take advantage of having
Thank
talked
you.
today. My question is, I want to focus on journalism. So I work in media and policy communications, and one of the things that was really apparent throughout this campaign was the degree to which trusted news sources really failed to do their job. Yeah. And the example just from today where the Washington Post actually caught someone trying to feed them fake news, that's how it is supposed to work. You're supposed to have editors and journalists who vet their sources, who check the veracity of stories, who make sure that they're not spreading misinformation to their readers. Those are their brands. And my question is, without getting into the fact that, yes, Craig, when he created Craigslist, started the media on a long, slow slide to a huge challenge in their business model. Let's put that aside for a second. How much can we hold journalists, what can we do to sort of prop up journalism? Because there are trusted sources. I kind of want to push back a little on the notion that just because somebody saw it on Facebook, they're going to be more prone to believe it. I mean, people do put varying degrees of trust in different institutions. Can you talk a little bit about what we can do to sort of bring journalism back to the center of this core role? I mean, because that's really what you're talking about is failed here in this.
So part of the challenge here is that it's very difficult in the internet age to find who a journalist is and what is news, right? For the reasons I was saying before. And so, because information is coming, so is the Drudge Report journalism, right? Is Breitbart, is Huffington Post, is, are your friends, right? The bloggers and our academics who are putting it up. And so that's a particularly challenging question. And it's challenging all across many different legal domains because you're going to have to figure out some way, if we're talking about regulating the media, right, or even propping up media, who is it we're talking about, right? And so, this is a very difficult question. And so then, Facebook has these efforts right now, as you probably know, to sponsor local journalism, to really juice it up. The foundations are coming in, and Google, all of the platforms have something to do with this. There are other ways we could think about making journalism a little bit more profitable again, because of course, as you know, the platforms are basically destroying the advertising and business model of these legacy publications. And so one thing that's been floated is to essentially make them 501c3 organizations so that you could, if you contribute to the, and interestingly, the New York Times now has an affiliated 501c3, and there are places like ProPublica, right, that are trying to do this. So that's one way you could try to beef up the for-profit model. But it's hard. If you go into the Washington Post building, as I have before, in the journalism room, literally hovering over the journalists, is a screen about 4 times the size of Otto here, right? With the traffic on the website in numbers in real time, so that you know how much traffic the Washington Post website is getting at any given second of the day, right? if that's the environment we're living in, right, and it's the Washington Post, right, it's like, what do we do to change that?
Another question right here at the bar.
What about traceability or citations? Are there discussions of this where you would cite the article that cites the article that cites the original article? Now, I come from science, so I know you can always find something to support any position you want, but sometimes it's maybe a recognized, high-quality journal, sometimes it's a low-quality journal.
Yeah, and Facebook's trying to do that. They're trying to show the origin of, there are methods that they're adopting to try to go after that. Now, it's a pretty elite group of people who are going to do that kind of investigation, and, look, I don't think most of the fake news stories had any effect on the election, right? I don't think, like, the Pope endorses Donald Trump, it's like, oh my God, well, I was in equipoise before, but oh, well, the Pope endorsed Donald Trump, so therefore, I'm voting, right? And so it's a real question as to whether fake news had any effect, right? But there's no question that there's widespread false beliefs out there, and that the internet echo chambers, the Pizzagate scandal being the kind of classic example of this, as to how certain types of rumors then have real-world effects. But that falls into my disclosure bubble, right, or bucket, as to what kinds of techniques we can use in order to show the origins of information and the source. And frankly, these corporations the platforms are doing it already. And so I'll give you another example. Facebook has moved in the direction of downgrading content that is forwarded to you by a friend where that friend has not engaged with the content, right? So that you might think, if virality is a problem, and particularly kind of clickbaitishness, and so if I see something that's just evoking emotion, I was like, I just forward it to you, right? And I don't actually look at the article, that is then deprioritized in the algorithm, as opposed to something I actually read and then potentially evaluated and then sent to you.
Let me ask you, so talking about journalism, I think in some ways we've seen some really strong responses in the media of in some ways, like antibodies. Some of the current regime and the fake news stuff that's out there has brought out the best in some of the news sources that are out there. I wonder if you have a comment on that, and also if to some extent, are you hopeful at all that the law, that our democracy will have some strengthening based on some of these challenges? It seems like there are some very faulty arguments made, whereas we might have expected sort of more cleverness from a different, some different approaches to infringing on the Constitution, but in some ways because of some of the Twitter sloppiness of the Twitterer in chief, or other things. Are there potentially some good outcomes where we've talked a lot about the flouting of norms, and in the short term that's a real problem? Longer term, is it possible some norms will turn into laws in our legal system that have just been sort of custom before? Or are there other aspects that you see of positive outcomes to some of the atmosphere there's been?
So that's obviously a larger question beyond the internet. The irony, of course, is if you're looking for hope, it's coming from the most undemocratic institutions, namely the courts, right? And so, and that's a slender reed on which to hang your hopes, right? Not only because the courts can change and there's going to be, massive numbers of appointments and the like, but, the sort of vicissitudes of judicial behavior is not necessarily always liberty protecting. But of course, we've seen the courts being the fulcrums on which a lot of these policies are sort of depending. Now, on journalism, yes, there's been a renaissance, right, of both new and legacy journalism, right? BuzzFeed has done some incredible work on, for example, on bots, right? I learned stuff from there, and bots and foreign intervention. And, legacy, and so you look at The Atlantic has done incredible work, and of course, New York Times and Washington Post have, been, I don't know if you ever saw this great story about Maggie Haberman literally writing an article while she is watching her sort of daughter's third grade performance or something, right, that like gets her the Pulitzer Prize, or it's like some incredible, because imagine what it's like to be one of these people, one of those journalists. I've had some of them come to my class. You think the bags on my eyes are dark? It's like they're working 24 hours a day. They can never expect.
And some real gumshoe stuff, like the Trump charity stuff.
Right, David Fairnhold stuff. Yeah.
I think we've got one right there. Go.
Yeah. Hi. So I'm assuming that most people here can remember a time when we weren't entirely dependent on the internet, but the same can't necessarily be said for the the kids that are growing up today. So with that in mind, do you think that it's necessary or appropriate to engage the younger generations in the conversation about sort of like this disparity of opinions and authenticity that exists on the internet? I don't know what that looks like, whether it's systemic or what. It's kind of a dovetail off of that education question earlier, but what is your thought on that?
Yeah, well, and I think it's absolutely critical. Because, for example, right, if the problem is Facebook, then, like, young people are not using Facebook, right? And so, for the most part, no offense to the Facebook employees in the room, but they're using Instagram, so, you can buy another company. Or Snapchat, right? There's some really interesting work being done about how the Russians used some of these other platforms and how images then, and memes were then sort of polluting these other platforms. So yes, I think it's absolutely critical. And we at CASBS, the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science, they have the whole project called the iGen Project, which is all about people who've only grown up knowing the internet, right? And how do they behave? How do they communicate? How do they have relationships online, right? All that kind of stuff.
And your First Amendment class is it to undergrads?
Yeah.
Or, yeah. And so,
well, I teach at both, but yeah. So I get undergrads to take I teach an undergraduate First Amendment class, and they educate me, right, about some of these technology issues, especially at Stanford, where you have some of the techies who'll come and take it. It's really, eye-opening.
Is there an anecdote, is there anything particular that jumps out at you that you've learned there or that surprised you about their attitudes, either on the positive or the negative, that you heard back from your class?
Well, one of my former students is Ty Montgomery, who currently plays for the Green Bay Packers, which I'd say, I used to teach at Columbia. That never happened to me there, right? So that's something that happens at Stanford. But, thinking about what they sort of think about, they are very familiar. They all have stories, right, about how rumors have spread and how, reputations that get destroyed. And so they know it, but they also, it's been amazing to me that sometimes, and this happened with one of my students who was live blogging my class, and then when I called her out on it, like not in an aggressive way, I said, for those of you live blogging, and she thought I was like invading her private internet at that point. It's like, to some extent, they don't quite get the fact that, we can see all of these things and they're there for perpetuity.
Hey, thanks. When reading your concluding questions, my mind goes in a direction. I want to see if it's kind of where you're going to. In that, I definitely agree that the democratic character of the internet itself, right, threatens democracy as we know it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I would also say that the nature of the internet and how it works in many of its institutions threaten sovereignty as we know it, national sovereignty as we know it, and then many of the institutions that you're working with are inherently transnational institutions, corporations, Facebook, et cetera. And so those, and you said yourself that in fact those are the institutions now that are interpreting the First Amendment. Yeah. They're transnational institutions. And so your last question to the audience, so to speak, is Europe or China or the United States, or is it really a transnational institution that's the wave of the future, and is the internet making sovereignty obsolete, and does democracy depend on sovereignty or not?
Yeah, no, that's right, and that's one of my first questions, right? To what extent do you need a organizing structure, a domestic organizing structure in order to organize political conversation for the democracy? And I think that the transnational character of both these companies and the internet in general is what's really threatening that.
Let's take a step back. We've got a book that you've edited in the back. Let's just speak for a second about that. I think, can you just tell us what that is? Let people know what it is, and you're gonna.
Oh yeah, well.
Is it relevant anymore? Is it still?
Well, this is the problem. I've been writing this book on democracy and the internet now for. I started this proposal now 3 years ago. And the topic of the book has changed 180 degrees, right? Because as I was saying, we had this kind of euphoric and optimistic view of the internet. Now it's completely changed. And one of the areas that sort of contributed to this was what was in that earlier book, which came out. This was a Hewlett Foundation sponsored project on trying to solve polarization, right? Trying to get the smartest, get my political science friends who are smarter than I am to propose, to sort of put their money where their mouth is and propose solutions to political polarization. Now, the polarization that we saw a year and a half ago when this was published, right, is completely different than the polarization that we're talking about now. I mean, it's just an order of magnitude. It's not just an order of magnitude, it's just a different kind of polarization when you talk about the culture and obviously what's happening in the Trump administration. But this is these are the top political scientists who study polarization, each proposing some kind of solution to polarization that we see at the elite and mass level.
And that's the book we have back here, and he'll be able to sign them afterwards. I think we've got one more question from the audience. And then Nate's going to be sticking around so we can keep the conversation going afterwards. We'd love for you to stick around. One more
yes.
question.
One of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, John Gilmore, has famously said that the internet perceives censorship as damage and routes around it. What would you say to this kind of amoral, almost Nietzschean position that sees these developments as not good or bad, but inevitable adaptations?
Could you just say, I was moving over here as you were talking, just the quote is, internet perceives censorship as...
The internet perceives censorship as damage and routes around it.
Well, that's, to some extent that is true, except when it's not, which is to say that obviously China is an example in the other direction, right? And the Chinese are not able to, I mean, they've been figured out a way to wall off that garden. But, there's censorship in the kind of deletion. That's why I put up all those different strategies, right? Because there's deletion of content. And yeah, look, you're able to usually, if you were an enterprising French voter and you wanted to figure out a way to get the Macron email dump in the 48 hours before the election, a lot of the hackers in this room could figure a way to do that. But most people in France did not see that stuff, or at least wasn't coming over their Facebook feed. And so, there are examples of where this kind of censorship in an electoral context actually works. But again, part of the question is not about deletion of content or prohibiting you from seeing it. It's about how it's organized before you and what values go into that organization as what you're going to see at the top and what you're going to see at the bottom.
And just before we let you go, to go back to gerrymandering for one second, we were talking a little bit. I wanted to just draw you out a little bit on the class that you taught. So, which is an interesting. For those who don't know, so you taught a class about districting when you were at Columbia. You want to tell a little bit about how that worked and what the outcomes of it were?
So one of the interesting things about people, there are very few people who work in this area. That's why I've gotten some of these jobs, especially for courts. Actually, the first time I got it, I think I was 29 years old when I did the New York congressional redistricting. And the reason I did it is because everybody else in the country was conflicted out who did this, right? And so that's how I started working for courts. And I don't work for political parties. I've just worked for courts and doing these redistricting things. And so at Columbia, I developed drawcongress.org, where we had the students develop nonpartisan plans for all the 50 states, just so they could develop the skills, and then so that there could be kind of benchmark nonpartisan plans that were out there that you could then judge the partisan plans against.
And those are actively being used today for?
Well, no, they're being actively ignored by politicians, but they
actively ignored, exactly.
The consequence of it, right, was that the media at least had something, what was possible. Like if you say you can't draw a district this way, well, actually, there's a 24-year-old student at Columbia who has figured out a way to do that. So, yeah.
Well, I know that there continue to be a ton of questions, and we want to get to more of them. Thank you so much for opening yourself up to this big question time here. It's like the British government here for a second. Please give Nate a big round of applause.